He is currently a department head at Argonne National Lab, running the Department of Nanoscience and Technology Division and the Center for Nanoscales Materials there. And he is also a professor at University of Chicago in Institute for Molecular Engineering. As some of you here in the audience, he got his bachelor from Indian Institute of Technology in Kharagpur and then moved to US, getting his PhD in University of Southern California in '91. And after that, he spent quite some time in 3M in Minnesota. His work there is known because he was one of the first to develop 2.6 blue-green lasers. And right after that stage, he moved to IBM, where he spent 20 years going from research staff member to the director of physical sciences. He actually was my hiring manager, was there, and my manager for many years. And he spent, as a director of physical sciences, quite some time in developing many diverse areas that are now becoming very well known from IBM, including quantum computing, including silicon photonics that I was involved with, and many other areas around. And recently, 3 years back, he moved now to academia, to Argonne Lab, and changed the subject of his work. His work in IBM was mostly in developing new materials for CMOS semiconductor technology, and that's what he is most known for and most famous for developing of high-K metal gate stacks that is now on every and each of microprocessors, from high-end computers to your iPhones and iPads. And for that, he was elected into National Academy of Engineering. He got a number of prizes for that. After he moved to academia and to Argonne, he changed his subject quite drastically, as you can see today. He'll be talking about networks for sensing, for the quality of water, for the quality of soil, and that is very exciting areas that he'll be talking about. So, just in the token of our appreciation of him coming here, I want to give him a memorabilia plug like that, for just to be thankful for coming here.
So thank you very much for that kind introduction, Yuri. It is always great to see old friends and colleagues, and I see among the faculty here quite a few of my old colleagues from IBM research. What I'm going to speak to you about today is cyberphysical networks for agriculture, soil, and water. There are many collaborators here from IBM research in India, the University of Chicago, Harris School of Public Policy, Administrative Staff College. There are a bunch of other Indian universities as well, and a whole bunch of undergraduates at the University of Chicago who actually played a major role in the building of this system. If I look at a cyberphysical sensing network, it consists of a setup like this. Is a bunch of sensors that you can imagine you can screw in and out like light bulbs out of a central system. The data is then aggregated and sent typically using a wireless system, and then the data is curated on a cloud somewhere. And this wireless system, it can have different data rates. It can be low power. There's an issue of range. But these are things that are increasingly available. There's options available today for IoT wireless networks. So this is something that wasn't there or wasn't convenient, say, even 6 or 7 years ago when we first started getting interested in this type of thing. But today it is increasingly available. And then on the web or on the cloud, you can curate different data, layers of data, and I'll get into that a bit later on. And then you can combine it with analytics and physics models to generate new types of information that you can push to customers and users. Now this whole system today is gated by the quality of the sensors available. Even today, the sensors are not cheap enough, not efficient enough, not power efficient enough, not sensitive enough. And this, to me, is the challenge going forward. And I believe there's an enormous opportunity in the area of sensors. And again, this to me is probably the calling card of the nanosciences and nanotechnology going forward. Okay? In cases where such sensing is available easily and cheaply, you can see the amount of impact that has occurred. You know, Google Maps is an example, for instance, just GPS data, right? That gives you this entire system that, you know, and convenience that's available. So today still a lot of analytics is still driven by data that is available through, you know, some kind of business transaction or marketing data or social data, et cetera, et cetera. But the transition is slowly going to happen into the realm of physical data, and this is where I emphasize again sensors and sensor technologies become important. So what interests me and my group is sort of large-scale geographical sensing for soil and for water, and it has many uses. I will try to show you 3 examples today. One is in the area of agriculture. This is work that I did while I was still at IBM. And this is what got us excited about this business. You know, many other fields have been deeply influenced by data analytics and, you know, IT technologies and so on. Agriculture hasn't so much, and agriculture is still you know, followed in a sort of old-fashioned traditional manner, because of which there is overuse of fertilizers, there's overuse of water, and the environmental consequences of these are quite high. And if one can measure these things and dose the amounts based upon measurements and calculations, I'll try to show you an example. There can be huge benefits. Then there is soil, right? This is, you know, this impacts all of us. This impacts the earth, you know, but we don't know very well, if I speak with my soil scientist colleagues, how evolution of soil occurs. You know, we don't clearly understand the carbon cycling models, nitrogen cycling models, phosphorus cycling models. We don't clearly understand the soil microbiome and its effect on the nature of the soil, on the texture of the soil, and the plants that grow on that soil. So this whole business lacks adequate data. And there is a big interest today, particularly in the National Science Foundation, of trying to develop these sensor networks for soil science. And then the third area is an example I'll show you in water, where you know, it's obviously contamination of large water bodies, particularly in the developing world, is of critical interest, and I'll show you some examples of some studies that we have been doing in India. So the 3 examples I'll give you in agriculture. This is an earlier project done while I was at IBM. It's a project between IBM and Gallo. It's a 2-year test on a vineyard that Gallo has in California, okay, where we control drip irrigation using satellite data. I'll get to that in a moment. The second is an example of a fully buried sensor network that we call Thoreau, that we set up at the University of Chicago. Everything is buried, the sensor, the wireless, everything. I'll show you examples from that. And the third is heat mapping of water quality in large bodies of water in India. And this is a project that is being funded by the Tata Foundation and by funding from the Gates Foundation. So let me start with the example of agriculture. There was a guy called Nick Dukuzian, who is the vice president of research at Gallo. He was an ex-professor at UC Davis. He's a very forward-thinking guy. So we met him one day and we started talking, and we learned how they do their irrigation in grape cultivation. And it's typically something known as drip irrigation. How many of you know what drip irrigation is? Raise your hands. Okay. So basically you have these plastic tubes that have holes in them, and then you put water through it, and the water comes out of those holes, and that's how you irrigate the field. And typically the way it's done today is you just let the water out, and it's kind of like a mean field approximation of irrigation of the water. So what we decided to do was that we would pixelate this irrigation so that we could dose selected areas. In this case, we could control the amount of water we are delivering to, say, 30 by 30 meter tiles. Okay? So we selected a control region, and we selected a region where we were going to fool around with the irrigation. Okay? So what we did is the process that we followed is, so what's important in these vineyards? So a way to test the maturation of the vines is to look at the greening of the canopy. And the greening in a vineyard typically can happen unevenly. So we would evaluate this greening using satellite data. So you can get free satellite data that you can download from Landsat images. You can get data of any location of the world twice a month. And you can think of this as some form of optical spectroscopy because the data is available in 11 wavelength bands. So there is a way to estimate the greening, and there are formulas for that. You use the red and the green wavelength data, etc., etc. But you can estimate the greening. And so we would get the Landsat data, and we would find out how much, with a resolution of 30 by 30 meters, the extent of greening of the canopy. Then we would also estimate the water transpiration, the amount of water that is lost by a plant. And that is estimated by getting data of wind speed, relative humidity, temperature, stuff like that, right? And these are all standard formulas that we use. We're not doing any new science over there. But we can get all of this information, again, off the web. And then there are agricultural models where you take the greening data, you take the evapotranspiration data, and then you can calculate how much water you want to give to the plant by assuming a certain amount of stress level that you want to give the plant or you don't want to give to it. Okay? So in this way, we can calculate how much water this 30 by 30 meter tile needs. And then, as I mentioned earlier, by putting valves and things like that, we pixelated the drip irrigation. Here's a photograph. And so we were able to dose water differentially. So if a region looked browner than the other regions, you gave it more water, for instance. And if something was already quite green, you held back the water. And when you get an even green, then during the harvest, my colleagues at Gallo said that the quality of the wine is also better because there's more evenness in the taste. Okay. So we did all of this over 2 seasons, and the results were really very, very promising. These are just some photographs, control region, etc. I'm going to skip this. And these were the results. That they looked at 2 things. They looked at, so we had a control region. They had a region that they wanted to optimize for yield, and they had a region they wanted to optimize for water efficiency. And in both the regions for yield and water efficiency, they saw sort of 10 to 20% improvement over a couple of years. And it typically takes about 3 years or so for this efficiency to keep growing. So our colleagues in Gallo were very excited by these results. So this is the first experiment that we did in agriculture that really sort of opened our eyes to what we can do if we can start taking the kind of data that is available to us today with technology and try to apply it towards something, in this case, what we call digital agriculture. So, and this we did simply from greening data, right? We call it NDVI from the satellites. Now imagine if you could measure parameters in the soil, and if you could measure it cheaply, how much more efficient agriculture would get. So on the left side, I've put down, like a whole set of things that you could measure in agriculture, in the soil, in the root, in the plant, etc., etc. Now, that's a long list. If you could just measure 4 things, microprecipitation, meaning within a field how much variation there is in the rainfall that's falling. If you could measure moisture content in the soil accurately and cheaply. Today, for instance, you can do point measurements, but soil is a very irregular medium, so you really want measurements that are averaged over about a meter or so. If you could measure the temperature of the soil surface and nitrate content, that's very important because there is no good way to measure dissolved nitrate content in soil. If you could, then one could cut the use of fertilizers by a factor of possibly 2 to 3x. And there are estimates that show that a big chunk of the fertilizers that are applied throughout the earth go off as runoff, and in the end they get into rivers, and then they get into the ocean, and they create problems because there is algal growth and growth of plants stimulated by the nitrogen, because of which the light is reduced, and then that affects fish life in the water. So these are known issues. So if you could just measure things like microprecipitation, moisture content, temperature, nitrate, that would be huge. Think of these as vertical stacks of data that goes in that you can then use agricultural models like the one I showed you for the case of calculating the amount of water you needed to create these new layers of data. Right? So this sort of got us interested in the business of agriculture, and this then led us to speak to soil scientists. Who then pointed out to us that there's a big scientific issue in itself that is inclusive of agriculture, and that is about how, as I mentioned earlier, how does soil evolve? This is really important from food security point of view, from the point of view of environmental management, etc., etc. And so are there ways of using today's emerging technology to measure soil parameters? So that stimulated the second project that I'm going to talk about, which is in creating this fully buried sensor network on campus at the University of Chicago Hyde Park campus. So you can see all of our data on this website called Thoreau.uchicago.edu, and we named it after the American philosopher turned environmentalist Thoreau. As many of you probably know, Thoreau lived in the Massachusetts area in the 19th century, and he was probably the first person who started taking detailed data of the microclimate around the area where he lived, which was, I believe, Walden Pond. And he noted in his diaries when the frost happened, when the leaves changed color, when, things about the weather. And he made conclusions from these. And I think it would be correct to point him out as one of the sort of first data-driven environmentalists. And if you fast forward to today, where we can measure so many other things, I think, environmental engineering and environmental science can really benefit enormously if we are able to measure a whole bunch of parameters with high spatial and temporal resolution. So when we set up this buried sensor network, I wanted to see whether it was possible to build a reliable sensing network using off-the-shelf components. I had been trying to do this for a while at IBM as well, and about 10 years back, if you tried to do this, there were too many custom components. And as you try to put a custom network, it's not scalable because it's just too complicated. You try to put a wireless thing, people have IEEE this and IEEE that, and by the time, if you're not a specialist, you don't know what to do, right? But I wanted to be able to have sort of a plug-and-play thing. And we've come to the point where I think those technologies are available. They're still not cheap, but I think that price will go down going forward in future. So we wanted to demonstrate this, and I deliberately wanted to see if we could do this primarily using undergraduates. Okay? And then I wanted to have an open data platform where all of this data would be freely available to anyone to analyze and study. I wanted to see if you could have, buried drop and forget sensors. And eventually I wanted this to be sort of a neutral territory where you could benchmark different technologies against each other and so on. Okay? So let me briefly give you a description of what we did. So first you need a wireless network, and there are different choices here. You can either go through sort of a proprietary system. So for instance, there is a company called Sigfox. It uses 900 megahertz ultra narrow band. Today, they have actually services in the major cities. You pay them sort of a subscription fee. It's a small charge per sensor, and then you will be on their network. And this is low data rate, so you can't transmit an image, maybe 12 bytes a packet. It's good for what we want to do, measure surface parameters, etc. It's long range if the sensor antennas are outside, but I'll show you even under the ground, the range is quite long. So we use Sigfox. There are other options. There is a sort of more open, free platform called LoRa, and it requires a little more development. So right now, we are also trying to build a wireless network using LoRa. So you can benchmark one against the other, and there are a few other types of networks that are there as well. Okay? So when you have a sensor, you also need a little sensor, system around it, right? So the data comes in from the sensor, then there's a little microcontroller unit that does some of the processing. There's a battery. At the end of the day, we researched this a lot, and we found that basically the big AA batteries are the ones that are the best for our purpose. You need a little bit of a power management circuitry, and then you need a radio, and then you need an antenna. Remember, our antenna is buried underneath the soil. How many of you think that if you took your cell phone, dug a hole in the ground, threw it, buried it, you'd still get a signal? How many of you think you would? Just raise your hands. That's a good question. See, if you buried it about 10 inches or so. In a cell phone, because the frequency is rather high, the transmission isn't great. But for something in the 900 megahertz range, you can bury an antenna down to 10 to 14 inches, and there's enough signal that comes out of the ground that refracts out of the ground, which is what we observe. Typically, it's very important to have the antenna buried because the soil will be tilled, there'll be stuff happening on the soil, so typically you want to leave 6 inches from the surface, not having anything sticking into it. So there's room here for antenna design, I'm sure, but again, we used standard components. So this is what our sensor boxes look like. We used chipsets from TI. One can also use chipsets from Atmel. It's not a big deal. We had to play around a bit with power management, leakage power, etc., etc. But in the end, we built our box in something that was maybe 4 by 4 by 4 inches. It can be scaled down much smaller. This was just our first generation package. But we built this package, and then we installed these things in around 28 locations near our Hyde Park campus. Okay, and we had the antenna and the box sitting on top of the building that I have my office in, or the Eckhart Research Center. So we found initially that even with the antenna buried, something like 10 to 14 inches beneath the soil, we were getting signals from as far away as 1.4 miles. So this is the Hyde Park campus. That over there is the backyard of my house. So what happened is I had a Russian undergraduate student, Arseny Andreev. He built these boxes, he set up the antenna. It took some time, and then he wanted to test it. And if you wanted to put it within the campus, you have to go get permissions and so on. So here is Washington Park. It's next to Hyde Park. And he called me. He said, I bought a shovel. I'm going to go to Washington Park. I'm going to dig a hole. I'm going to put the sensor box in there. I told him, look, this country is now paranoid. You're a Russian guy. They catch you putting something like this in a public park. You'll be in trouble. You go to my house and put it in there. So that's how the first data point was collected. But since then, what's happened is that Sigfox, the IoT wireless company, has been installing many such antennas around the city of Chicago. And our signals are seen from downtown, which is about 5.5 to 6 miles away. So this is something that we just learned very recently, that as this thing progresses, we can pick up the signal from far away. Based upon these studies, we've started an NSF-funded project to set up a sensor network, now this time working with real soil scientists on a site that Argonne manages, that is in the Fermilab space, which is sort of in the suburban areas of Chicago. And even there's enough of these Sigfox antennas that we don't have to worry about actually putting an antenna in there. And that's a huge benefit to us. This is how it looks. So we dig the hole, we put it in, and then it's like cover it up with grass. There's nothing on top, right? So it is completely, this is completely compatible with agriculture and things like that. So we wanted to just demonstrate a working system. It's been running for over a year. We've had issues, most of them relating to packages, things that we hadn't anticipated. These are engineering kind of issues. We seal it. In winter, things become cold. The gas inside, the air inside the package, the pressure reduces. There's kind of a vacuum suction. Stuff comes in. And then in summer, there is moisture problems on the inside. So those are little things that we have to work around. That's what we are learning with this system. Battery life is another issue. But by and large, the system has been working. We've been taking, various, what we found, for instance, is that by tracking the strength of the wireless signal, I'll come to that in a moment, actually. But you can see things like the electrical conductivity varying. It depends upon the volume water content, can actually tell you what kind of soil it is from the behavior after the rains. You can do things like heat mapping. So you can these are the 6 things we are measuring. RSSI is sort of signal strength. But this was meant to be an example that you can run and demonstrate a working system, over time. But this is, again, the Hyde Park campus. This is the Midway Plaisance, and Lake Michigan is somewhere over here. As you can see, typically the winds blow along the Midway Plaisance, so it gets quite cold there during the winter. I am not a wireless person, but we have a collaborator there, and so there have been some measurements of the wireless signal strength. There was some modeling, but basically, things behave as expected. The signal refracts out of the ground and goes into the receiving antenna. What we also noticed is that you can measure the wireless signal strength, for instance, to determine the soil moisture content, because as the soil moisture content changes, the refractive index changes, and so the transmission and properties of the signal changes. So we find interesting things like these. I won't go into the details of. Let me now move to the third part of my talk, which is the longer part, which is I'll describe to you some experiments that we've been doing in India in measuring water quality in large water bodies. So water pollution is a major issue in India. For instance, the longest river in India is the Ganga River. A huge fraction of India's population lives off of its valley. It has major problems with pollution, especially as the river heads southwards towards the Bay of Bengal. There's fertilizer runoff, there's industrial pollution, bacterial contamination, fecal bacterial contamination is a big issue. I'll give you an example. Today in the US, if you had more than 300-400 coliform forming units measured in 100 milliliters of water, you would not be able to swim in that lake by regulations. In the Ganga, towards its mouth near the city of Calcutta, these numbers are as high as 100,000 to several 100,000 coliform forming units per 100 milliliters. Okay? The other issue is, and this is true across developing nations as well as developed nations, there aren't enough water quality monitoring stations. In India, for instance, water quality is monitored roughly every 40-50 kilometers and roughly twice a month. But a lot of that data is unreliable, it's not collected properly, not measured properly. So the quality and integrity of data is also a big issue. So we started a project at first in a river called the Godavari River, which is the second longest river, and it's in southern India. So let me skip to that. And then that project quickly morphed into monitoring a bunch of other rivers. But Godavari also has about more than 60 people live in its basin. We started with a town called Rajamundry, and this is where we sort of set up and qualified our system. So this is a map of India, and I'll come to it soon. The stars show all the places where we've been doing our measurements now over the past 1.5 to 2 years. So let me talk about what are we sensing and how are we sensing this. So what are we interested in sensing? So this table shows the things that you'd like to typically sense in water. And if I look at the green part of this table, pH, turbidity, dissolved oxygen, electrical conductivity, total dissolved solids, nitrates, dissolved nitrates in water. It's indicative of various things, fertilizers, fecal waste, industrial pollution, stuff like that. But these things in green, you can buy a sensor that will measure this stuff, and the sensor will cost between, let's say, $2,000 to $5,000. Okay. Then let's go to the bottom. There's the stuff in the pink. These are trying to figure out ways of assessing microbial life in water. There's this thing called biochemical oxygen demand. You try to see how much oxygen is consumed in the water. That tells you, how much living species there is in the water. And then you do these microbiology type experiments to measure the amount of E. coli. Now, both of these items are important from a health perspective, extremely important. But reliable measurement of these parameters takes 3 to 5 days because you have to culture stuff and count stuff. And more important than that, you can screw up your experiments if you don't do it right. And then in the yellow are things that can perhaps give you indication of organic content in the water. Things like tryptophan. This is a protein that is released when E. coli dies. Then there's chlorophyll, and there's something called colored dissolved oxidative matter. This is why some water bodies look greenish, for instance, not completely clear because CDOM levels are high. So sensors for these have just started becoming available, and these sensors will cost you today about to $20,000, 15 to 12 to $20,000, depending upon options. So they're expensive. But my guess is that the price of these sensors will start reducing. A lot of these sensors today are optically based, and this is because packaged lasers, detectors, etc., at different frequencies, etc., are becoming increasingly available and cheap. Right? So tryptophan, chlorophyll, CDOM, these are measured today by some kind of detection of luminescence at some wavelength band. So all of these are optically driven. And then there are, of course, a lot of these things like conductivity. These are standard electrolytic type measurements. So those are the two primary modes of measurements that are becoming popular. So one of our goals was to see, can we measure all this stuff to infer E. coli or biochemical oxygen demand? So these were our goals, right? One is set up the system and show that it works. Again, it's based on, a curated data, website where all the data is available to everyone, collecting the data and sending it up to the website, right? And show that it works. Two is try to see if you can use these techniques to develop regulatory compliance methods. Three is trying to infer things like E. coli BOD, which I mentioned. And four, and this is the most difficult piece of it, is to try to connect these scientific measurements to socioeconomic parameters, like local health, jobs, migration, things like that. So we've started talking with people from the social sciences, the Harris School of Public Policy, Ambedkar University in India. We've started some experiments, but this is the trickiest part and it's going to take some time. But water is a big thing going forward. I mean, there's fights happening because of water across the globe, and maybe there'll be wars for water going across the world. India, for instance, has very severe water problems, and we don't consciously recognize this with clarity today. So let me start. I'll give you some examples of our measurements, okay? So let me start with where we began our experiments to set up the system, which is in southern India, near Godavari. So when I showed you the buried sensor network, we used fixed sensors buried under the ground. In India, we went to a different approach. We went to a mobile sensor platform with GPS. There were several reasons for this. So we take the mobile sensor platform, put it on a boat, the boat goes around the river, and it collects data, and so in the end you get this data as a function of position of these 10, 12 parameters, whatever it is. And so now you have your heat map right there. And the advantage is that with fixed sensors, it just becomes very expensive having so many fixed sensors if you want really high spatial resolution. You'll get better time resolution. Because with the boat, you can do it maybe once a week, twice a week, thrice a week, something like that. Labor is cheaper in India, so you can think of, hiring a boat and a boatman, but you can also put this eventually on some kind of a, motorized boat, automated sort of robot or a drone kind of thing. And the third reason was a more practical one, and that was the chance of theft, that if I had fixed sensors, there's a higher chance that it would just be stolen. Okay. And so those are my colleagues in India. These are two young men, and now we've hired a group of other young men and women on this project. That one on the left, on your right is Priyank. He was an analog IC engineer who was working in England, and he kind of got tired of it, and he came back to India, and he wanted to do things with social relevance that use technology. But I've tried to kind of get him to come back here to do his PhD, but he does not want to get back into electrical engineering again. He made it clear to me. And the guy on the left is Srinivas. He did his PhD on water quality from Andhra University. He's the son of an illiterate taxi driver. When I was growing up in India, it was more difficult for someone like that to go through the system, but he was a bright guy. He got all the scholarships at the right time, and he's basically our water guy. Okay? So the two of them pioneered this thing. So we go in the boat, and these are pictures of the sensors. These are HANA sensors, and the boat just goes around, and there's a GPS, and it logs all the data, and we can upload it to the cloud. So let me give you some examples of what this can do. Okay? So this is the river, and if you see on the right at the top, there is, let's look at the pH data. You can see that the pH is rather high in two places, one at the top, one at the bottom. The one at the top is a region where there's a paper mill. It's South Asia's largest paper mill. Here is this blown up. So that's the paper mill. And every time we go there, the pH is high. Right? And so is the electrical conductivity. And the drain from the paper mill ejects into the river somewhere there. So this led us to think that this is a great way of, figuring out whether, doing things related to regulatory compliance. Clearly, in this case, we suspect this is bleach, right, that is probably being ejected into the water. This is a second example. This is the town drain comes in, and depending on the time of day, you can actually measure that there's stuff coming out. So the next step for us, which we're trying to do right now, is measure the water velocity. We have to figure out the profile of the river there, so we can estimate the amount of stuff that is being dumped. And we're trying to find a good hydrologist whom we can collaborate with, because we have all the data for this. That would be what we would need to figure out regulatory compliance type models. Then we started making our measurements a little more sophisticated. We'd go across the river, linearly interpolate between points to get heat maps. And this is in a town called the town of Narsapur. This is the town. That side are the agricultural wastes. The river goes this way and dumps into the sea. And you can see there are two drains, and these, when I say drains, they are actually little canals that are maybe 12 feet wide. You can go up in a small boat, which we did. And you can see hot spots over there. And so clearly these drains dump into the river. The river is very fast flowing, so it kind of washes things away quickly. But if you go up the drains, you see that things like, dissolved oxygen are very low in these drains. Now, dissolved oxygen typically, should be at least above about 4 or so. If it is less than 2, then you start seeing anaerobic processes. So if you go near a very dirty sort of sewagey kind of drain, you'll often smell a sulfurous smell. I don't know if you've had this experience or not. If you smell that, it basically means that the oxygen is so low that anaerobic processes, and you're basically smelling sulfur, okay, or hydrogen sulfide coming out. Now, this is an example where the town has a solid waste dump that's right on the river. Okay? So solid waste comes and is dumped by the river, and it stays there. That's a photograph. And it's a hot spot where stuff leaches out from the solid waste dump and gets into the river. And again, you can measure these things. So we've measured the signal strength. Now the next step for us is trying to quantitate this through water velocity and the water profile measurements and estimates. I'll give you a second example from the city of Delhi, which is the capital. Now, this is old Delhi. It's a very old city, more than 500 years old. And there's a river called the Yamuna River that runs. Okay? There are 7 drains that drain the effluents from the city into this river. And there is a barrage over there at the top at the north. called the Wazirabad Barrage. And what happens is that they manage the water. So they will allow fresh water to come in, then they'll close it, then they'll let it be for some time, then they'll open it again. This is sort of their water management practice. Okay? So we tried to see what happens to the water quality through this cycle. So on July 5th of 2017, they allowed fresh water to come in and they closed it. So when they did that, and we are looking at the electrical conductivity over here, so it's measuring, the amount of ions available in the water. It's reasonably clean. The electrical conductivity is low, but you see the electrical conductivity is worse on the western bank because that's where the 7 drains are coming in. And then over time, because that barrage is closed, this has basically become like a lake. The water is stagnant, and as the refuse from the city keeps getting dumped, it becomes a lake full of you can almost call it a dead river at this point. It's the same thing with dissolved oxygen. Basically, the dissolved oxygen levels go really low, and that also goes further low during I think the evening. Evening is the time a lot of the refuse goes in. Okay? But basically, this is you go there, you can even smell the sulfur. So this can also be a tool for water management. Right? What I'm trying to impress over here is that by measuring, the dynamics of the contamination and how it's changing as a function of space and how it's changing over time, you can get a lot more information than just doing sort of, old-fashioned point-based measurements that we typically do. We've also measured in Varanasi, etc., but I will not really go into great details over here. These are some measurements in Varanasi. This is a holy city. There was a major festival on the 31st of I think January 2018, and that morning there were a lot of people who came in to bathe in the river, and what you find is that the dissolved oxygen goes down because there's a lot of contamination in the river. So you can see very interesting things. Then we started the second set of activities, which is what I had mentioned earlier. Can you infer properties of difficult to measure components by measuring a whole bunch of things that are instantly measurable? So we are in the middle of a long set of experiments where we sample the water, we take our sensor data, but we also sample the water and send it out to laboratories to get assays done on the water for a whole bunch of parameters that are listed over here. And then over a period of maybe a year or so, I think we want to get enough data points where we want to see if we can start seeing correlations. Most importantly, is there a way we can infer biochemical oxygen demand or total coliform or E. coli concentrations? And our initial studies are showing that this can be quite tricky, that we really need a lot of data. We probably need a lot of training data in order to be able to do this properly. So here is an example, right? So initially we thought, well, let's measure tryptophan because tryptophan is a protein that's released when E. coli dies. So if we can measure tryptophan, I should be able to get the E. coli concentration. There are problems here because tryptophan itself degrades pretty quickly, so it may not be the right indicator. So here's data from 3 different days from the same region, from the same town, Narsapur region, Godavari. If I plot all of this data, there is really no correlation. If I plot data taken on each different day, then I start at least seeing clear correlations on 2 of these 3 days. The 3rd day, there is no correlation. We need to figure out whether this was just some kind of an experimental error, samples were switched, or is this for real? But at least for 2 days, we see a correlation, but something has shifted between those 2 days. So this is the challenge, and this is for one town. Now, if you want to do a universal model for all rivers, lakes, that gets very, very complicated. But this is what we are trying to figure out now through a set of painstaking experiments where we are trying to correlate this lab data with the sensor data. And that can get tricky. I just learned 2 days back that our equipment that was measuring tryptophan, both of the sensors blew up, maybe because there was some power surge somewhere when we were downloading data. So I have to get that shipped from India to here, get it fixed, and ship it back again. So doing these experiments takes a long time and can be very frustrating. But in the end, the vision that I have is this notion of the geopixel, right? That a piece of land or water on this earth will have a series of vertically stacked data against it. It can relate to soil, it can relate to water, it can relate to population dynamics, but you could then use these various layers of data to develop new types of models to inform and develop recommendations for various things related to agriculture, related to water. If you're interested in making money, it can be related to financial forecasts. For instance, if you can predict how much corn, how much soy, how much wheat will be produced in the United States before the government releases the data, you will make money. Right? So there's a lot of opportunities over here in looking at this type of geospatial data. Coming back to the sensors, and I know I have a few minutes, they're still pretty expensive. I showed you the example with agriculture, right? We made an estimate of how much it would cost to sensorize a piece of land with a high enough resolution so that it would be meaningful. And if you take wine grapes, the total value of business per acre is roughly about $10,000 per year. And if you want a return on investment in 2 to 3 years, then each sensor should cost $60 to $70. Today, if you were to buy a sensor station like this, it will cost you between $1,000 and $3,000. So you can only put one every 1 to 2 acres or so. But then soil changes dramatically every 10 to 20 meters, so it really doesn't help you in a fine way. And for other things like sugarcane, $1,500, your sensor should be $10. Winter wheat, I don't even know if you can ever think of putting sensors in. So there are all these other economic issues over here. But if I look at sensors themselves, there's a lot of advance in nanotech, in CMOS technology, optoelectronics, low power electronics, that really the time has come. I think this is what, as I repeated before, nanotechnology can deliver. Sensors, etc., are still not good enough. Few minutes that I have, I'll switch gears to telling you a little bit about some of the research we are doing on sensor development itself. This is primarily the work of two of my really smart young colleagues, Zhofeng Zhang and Ben Dirol, both at Argonne. But what we are trying to do is use silicon photonics platforms with chemical functionalization to try to sense things. We are interested to start with to sense E. coli and also dissolved nitrates for soil. So these are the two things we're looking at. So in the silicon photonics experiments, basically these are ring structures coupled to waveguides, and there is evanescent coupling between them if they're close enough. And that coupling depends, very roughly put, on the refractive index of the dielectric medium. If you can change that on the surface, then you shift the resonances that you see. So the idea is that can you change that by attracting an analyte, by functionalizing the surface with some kind of chemistry. Okay. So Zhofeng is a sort of, electromagnetics, photonics expert. Ben is a materials chemist. So the two of them are working on developing these sensors. We have an NSF-funded project. So we've seen, for instance, that by using an ion-sensitive membrane above this silicon photonic structure, we think we can detect, nitrate concentration, dissolved nitrate concentrations down to about, few parts per million. These are still preliminary results at this point. Ben has been working on functionalizing a surface for E. coli. He was able to successfully doing that. I'm not a chemist, so I won't go into the details. I try to understand it, and every time I forget it. But basically, he's able to attach E. coli selectively to this layer that he coats the dielectric with that has these NH groups. Now, having done that, he's able to see only slight shifts in the silicon photonic signal because E. coli is mostly water. So the next step that he's trying to do is now trying to get gold nanoparticles to adhere on top of the E. coli so that the shift's going to be even stronger. So he's starting to see some results. These are all preliminary sort of work in progress. Okay? But that's the direction that we are going with the sensors. And so I think I'll conclude my talk here with the description of the Boquilla vine, which is a vine found in Chile. Now, this is a very interesting vine. It grows on trees, and when it grows on a tree, it has this unique character that its leaves mimic the shapes of the tree, of the leaves of the tree that it's growing on, right? And here are 3 examples, 1, 2, and 3. And it keeps changing that. And this vine, doesn't have eyesight, and it doesn't have vision in the traditional sense in which we define vision. So it's clearly sensing something, right? So this, to me, is sort of an evolved form of a sensing adaptive network. It is the form of sort of distributed sensing and computing, and it is the first early form of intelligence that we are trying to achieve in sensing networks. And that's sort of the goal of this entire business of cyberphysical sensing networks. And so with that, I will conclude my talk and take questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Guha, for great talk. So, questions, please.
Go ahead.
So, thank you very much for your talk. In terms of the sensing technologies, right, you mentioned about one of the biggest bottleneck as the box for confinement. But in terms of the sensing technology, how miniature you can dream of these sensors, and how dense the packed you imagine having these sensors in terms of technology?
So, the sensors can be very small. They can be maybe 100 micron. I'm sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. So the question was, how much can we get these sensor boxes and the sensor technology miniaturized, and what kind of densities are we shooting at? The sensor electronic packages, etc., can be probably shrunk down to millimeter size. The battery will determine the biggest volume. For things like soil, water, resolution you're looking for is greater than 20 meters, 10 meters, something like that, few meters. But for other things, if you want to sense, foods, things like that, you might wish even denser sensor networks.
This is kind of a silly question, but you said there's going to be wars over water. The oceans are rising. So this water question needs to be refined. What do you mean by water? I mean, the ocean is filled with water. It's got too much saline in it. So that's where the problem is. We've got plenty of water.
So two comments. One is I said there may be wars over water, not will be wars over water. And second is there are fights today over over usable drinkable water. In India, for instance, there are fights between states because a river's going from one state to another, and they release or don't release appropriate amounts of water. So that's the kind of water conflicts that I was referring to. There is also other things that go on, and I believe that happens or used to happen in the US as well. A state will clean its water, but won't clean its water that's going downstream and is close to the neighboring state to make it the next neighboring state's problems. So those are some of the issues related to, conflicts about water. So I was talking really about, drinkable water, usable water, that sort of thing. Water for agriculture too, because that, river water is used there. So the question was, have we done this for air quality monitoring? I was involved in a little bit of this when I was at IBM on air quality monitoring. It's done. Today people do it. They don't do it with very dense, high resolution, but there are, maybe locations every few kilometers or so in cities. It's difficult. So it does happen. It doesn't happen at a very, high resolution, etc. But actually, while I was at IBM, we were interested in looking at air quality monitoring in Beijing and in Delhi. And interestingly, in Delhi, the first, serious air quality monitoring station was put up, I believe, by the U.S. Embassy there. They just put it up there. And then other people saw it and started, putting up more points of detection.
I have a question, which is kind of more general. So this kind of projects do require building up several layers of kind of low-cost detectors, then spreading them out in the network, and building analytics on top of that. So most likely this is kind of national level project that's funded by the government, which is not then big of an interest for small companies to jump in and build new sensors that can be low down in price. At the same time, you've said already in the beginning of your talk that there are available data in exabytes from satellite images from somewhere else that are possible to use to get this analytics on top. So where you see the business opportunities here?
So those are two very good questions. So to comment on the satellite piece first, there's actually a lot of work that goes on in trying to see if we can use the satellite data to infer a lot of these properties. The resolution is poor. Typically, free satellite data, the best is maybe 30 by 30 meters or so. You can pay to get high resolution data, but then that becomes much more expensive. So the satellite data is not really that accurate for a lot of this. The second question is a very important one. How do governments will buy it? What is the business model here? And actually, we learned that the hard way. So, for instance, if you try to put an air pollution monitoring, set up in a city, cities typically don't have much money, so it becomes very hard. So, this whole smart city concept, it really, in my view, hasn't evolved because it's not clear what the business model is. The business model can't just be a philanthropic business model. So, in my mind, the way to establish systems like this is to have a paying model, okay? So I said, for instance, regulatory compliance could be a way to do this. And I'll give you an example of a paying model that works. I don't know if it's there in this country or not, but in many other countries like China and in India, there are traffic light mounted cameras. And you speed, it takes a picture of your license plate, and you get a fine in the mail. So if I am selling a system like this, I go to a government and I say, you don't have to pay me now, but you install this, you will make money in 2 years and just give me a cut of that. It's a working business model. Everybody makes money. I think that's what needs to happen over here. Otherwise, it won't be a scalable technology.
Any questions? Okay, what time do people again?